Now that we know how to use those basic concepts of photography inside our software, we're going to apply everything that we learned so far using a more in-depth approach on different aspects of light itself. And let's start that by learning the Kelvin scale. You probably must have heard about cold and hot light, which are terms used to define the temperature of the color. And we're going to learn just that now. The color temperature used in Kelvin scale is based on the quantity of light emitted when metals are heated. So that's why we have this scale set up the way it is. And the unit representation is known by the letter K. And on this graphic, we're going to present you different settings, different values on the Kelvin scale that will represent different light color temperatures. From 1000 to 2000 Kelvin, we have the measurement of the candlelight temperature, which is a very hot light, thus giving us a red or orange appearance. And also the Kelvin scale uses the sunlight position in different times of the day as a guidance for us to understand better the color temperature of that period. So usually in a sunset, the color temperature of that light at that time, it is around 3000 Kelvin. And by understanding the light temperature and color on the Kelvin scale, you can understand why an incandescent light produces a yellow tone or even orange tone to the ambient. That's because of the Kelvin scale temperature. It is because of the color temperature of the metal inside the lamp that gives out that range on color temperature around 3000 Kelvin. After that, there is the fluorescent lamps, which start to emit light on 4000 Kelvin and above. At 6000 Kelvin, the light setting here, the color temperature, is around the position of the sun in the midday. That's why we have an almost perfect balance here. Also, this temperature is used to configure the flash on different cameras. Above 7000 Kelvin, this light temperature is more similar to a hazy day. A blue sky without clouds has usually 10,000 Kelvin to 11,000 Kelvin range on the color temperature. And on this reference image, you can see that the color temperatures are at a range of 8000 K or Kelvin to 11,000 K Kelvin. And all of these values are important because we're going to use them when configuring our scene inside our V-Ray lights. We can set a very specific color temperature in order to achieve photographic results in our renders. Let me show you now where this parameter is located inside the V-Ray light. I have a V-Ray light here in the center of our grid, and here on intensity you have the option to choose its mode. You can choose a specific color here on the color selector, selecting even unrealistic color types, or you can choose here the option temperature. On this mode, all you have to do is change here the color temperature value using the Kelvin scale. If in this parameter I set the color to 1000 Kelvin, the color representation here shows what we have seen on the previous illustration, a candlelight type of color, thus a hot color. And if I set here the value to 6000 Kelvin, as you can see, the color representations turn here to an almost white tone, indicating a neutral light. 8000 Kelvin, the configuration of a hazy day. From 10 to 11,000 Kelvin, the configuration of color of a perfect blue sky. It is important for you to memorize the Kelvin scale in order to correctly set when you are creating your scenes, to be able to understand what you're trying to achieve and thus using the correct color temperature here on the Kelvin scale. Now we're going to learn how we use the hard and soft light principles inside our program. And to help us understand the difference between hard and soft light, we're going to use the sun as a reference. If direct sunlight illuminates an object, it's going to produce hard shadows around it. But if the sun is shining through a thick layer of clouds or even haze, that same shadow is going to be soft, thus the reference to a soft light. And that's why this type of sunlight diffusion is going to be called soft light. The scene that we're going to use to show these examples is comprised of a infinite background, a stool, two chamfered cubes, and a sphere. But before we start rendering to show the examples, I need to explain that every light inside V-Ray, the light emission is proportional to the size of the V-Ray light itself. And in this case here, this tool is about 40 centimeters in height, and our light is set to 100 to 100 centimeters or 1 square meter. And here we are using 120 watts power. I'm going to turn it on, and when we set here on the intensity options the unit to radiant power, that means that by changing the size here of the V-Ray light, the intensity of the value does not change. So the intensity will be the same, and what is going to change when we use a different size here on the V-Ray light, it is going to affect mostly our shadow parameters. If we use a photography term, we are changing the light modifier. We can change a soft light or a hard light by changing the size of the V-Ray light itself. All the shadows here are soft in correct relation to the size here of the V-Ray light. And here I've placed also two more V-Ray lights. I'm going to turn here the second light. And when we use only a single light source here on the right side, there will be areas in our render on the left side that will not be illuminated. And this second light with an intensity of 60 and also on the same size is going to give us the necessary fill light in order to illuminate the left part of the scene. Let me render again so you can see the result. Now this scene has a more even light proportion here from right to left, and above these elements there is another light with a radiant power of 25 watts and also using the same dimensions. And now let me render again with this upper light. Turn it on so you can see the difference. And with the three lights turn it on, you have a very balanced scene. And the same principle being used here in this almost like a studio setup can be used on bigger projects such as architecture. You can have the same relation to your subject of the lights that we are showing here, simulating with this configuration a hazy day. Now let me show here the examples prepared to show the hard light. I'm going to duplicate this frame here so we can later compare. And here on the right we have a V-Ray light with reduced proportion on its size. We have here 5 by 5 centimeters using a radiant power of 100 watts. Let me turn it on. And as you can see, with this small size, what you're actually changing is the light modifier. You're getting a very small area using the value of 100 watts, and that is producing a very hard light on our scene, producing a very defined shadow here on the ground. And this small light here is actually replicating the sun by giving us a very hard light on our scene. You can see here the shadow line is more intense. And by comparing with our last render, you can see that the soft light has less contrast between the brightest area and the darkest area. And in this example, the transition here between the point with more and less light is defined in a more pronounced way. And in our works, we don't have to specifically choose a soft or a hard light. And here on the other side, I'm going to show you a light with an 80 watts value, but using 100 by 100 centimeters here on its size. As you can see, there is the fill light here on the left side on a soft appearance, and the hard light here on the right with a more direct and well-defined shadow property. And these concepts of hard and soft light are also well applied in traditional photography. The smaller the light source, harsh the shadows, and the bigger the light source, the softer the shadows will be. And on these two settings here that I have created, you can see that the ambient is totally different from one to the other, just by simply changing the size here and the values of the light on the V-Ray light parameters. And by learning how to use a hard and a soft light, you can have a lot more flexibility in your projects. Light direction. And by changing here the light direction, we can highlight a texture, a shape, and by using the shadows on a scene, we can even hide some sort of imperfection. And on this graphic, you can see the different names that are used to represent the light direction in a scene. You have the front light, the side light, the fill light, the rim light, and upper light. Now we're going to see a series of examples that are going to be shown in a very practical way, each and every one of these light directions. And the scene that I'm going to use is the same that we had before, and the only difference here is that I'm using a bump map in all the materials to increase the effect so we can see better the changes here in light direction, how they are going to affect our models in terms of visibility of its texture and also to its final result. Let me start here with the side light by turning it on. And using only this side light, we get a very dramatic effect on our scene, where the light transition here between the highlight and the shadow area is more intense. And this side light here is great to show the objects in a three-dimensional way and even to highlight the object's textures. Now I'm going to render an example here with the fill light enabled. And this fill light is going to give us a more defined outer edge here on the objects. Let me turn on here now the frontal light or front light. And as you can see, this front line here reduced a lot the perception of the 3D depth of our objects, also reducing the perception of the textures on the objects themselves. Let me enable now the top light. This top light here produces a very characteristic shadow here in the bottom part, and in this case it completely removes the perception here of the texture on the ground because of the light angle being directed towards the ground itself. Let me enable now the rim light. And in this position, the light being placed behind the objects are going to emphasize the object's overall shape, which can be very useful when we are trying to emphasize that. And we don't have to choose specifically one or the other light direction in our scenes. We can learn now how to blend them together to get the perfect result. I have already saved here 3 light configurations to our scene. Let me load the first one now. And on this first set, I have 2 side lights and 1 fill light. Let me render so you can see the result. By combining here a very intense side light with a softer fill light on the left, we have a good lighting on the scene with medium contrast. And also here on the left, another side light with an intensity of 25. Here on the second set, you can see we have a side light, a fill light, and a top light. Let me render so you can see the effects of these lights. As you can see, the light is coming on a more intense way from the top. There is the presence here of the side light and also the fill light in the overall scene illumination. These 2 light sets are similar to each other, but you can see they produce a very different result in our final render. Let me duplicate this scene again. And our last set is composed of 2 side lights and 1 front light. And on this third set, as you can see, the light with higher intensity is here on the left, a fill light here on the right, and a front light here to balance those 2. And as you can see here, by using 3 different light sets, we can have a dramatic change in the overall look of our scene. And this is very important for you to understand that the positioning of the light on the scene is of fundamental importance, and you have to apply this knowledge of light direction in your scene in order to get the photorealistic result that you're looking for. Light hierarchy is basically the knowledge of the most important light in our scene and all the other lights that are going to compose the final result. On this illustration here, we can understand better this dynamic. The primary light will be always the most important light in our scene. It has the brightest intensity, the highest intensity. It will define the shadows in our scene and also the way that they are interpreted. And in the case of this graphic here, it is a side light, but it could be in any different position. The secondary light will be acting almost like a fill light in the scene with a lower intensity, and in this case, positioned on the other side of the object, acting almost like a rim light in this case. And the third light here can be used as a fill light to balance those 2 out and to give us a more pleasant overall result. And on this example scene here, I'm going to show how the hierarchy of lights act on our renders. Here on this scene on the right, we have a V-Ray light with 180 watts of intensity. On the left side, a 40 watts intensity, and a top light here with intensity of 15 watts. Let me turn on here our first light with a size of 80 by 80 centimeters. And this light here on the right is going to define our shadows. It is very important, this first light, because it's going to give us the ability to understand and read out this render scene, remembering that this side light is great to show the volume of the objects inside our render. So as you can see here on the left side of our render, there are very pronounced shadows, and this part of the chair is not receiving direct light from the V-Ray light. But sometimes this is a desired effect. If you want that to happen on the scene, you can place the light just the way you want. But in this case, we're going to enable a secondary light source to fill this shadows area. And as you can see, this secondary light gives us a more balanced light set in our render. And some people ask why the secondary light cannot have the same intensity as the primary light. And I'm going to show you that just now by changing the value here from 40 to 180 watts. And let me render again. And with this even light here on left and right, we have a very low contrast in the scene, and is making even more difficult to understand the overall shape of the object. And we clearly have a more difficulty here understanding where is the primary light. Here on the bottom, even the even shadows that are being produced. And that's why the primary light must be more intense than the secondary light. Let me reduce now the value of the primary light, inverting our scene configuration. And as you can see, we can clearly have a better perception of our object. The shadows are only being shown on one side, turning this image more pleasant to be seen, more realistic, more beautiful. Let me return now the light configuration to its previous setting and enable now the tertiary light that has a 15 watt power and has a size of 1 square meter. And I'm going to enable now this top light. Even the right or left lights cannot illuminate the center part here of the chair. So as you can see, when I enable the top light, gave us a better reading, a better perception of our object on the scene. And I'm going to use the same example here, the same set and even the light placement to show now how we can change completely the feeling of the scene by using a different Kelvin scale here on the light temperature. Instead of the color mode here, I'm going to use the temperature mode, set this right color here to 4500 Kelvin and render again so you can see the result. On the secondary light, I'm going to choose a different color temperature, a very cold light with a value of 7000 Kelvin. And as you can see here, the difference that is produced in our scene is very interesting. The light here on the right could be from the interior part of a set, and the left side here could be a window light from the outside. And if I invert here the color temperatures, and render again, and as you can see, we have a total different feeling now. The object seemed to be placed outside with a little hot light here on the left. And by choosing different light intensities, the position of them, and also the color temperature, we can produce scenes in a correct way, visually pleasant, and that produce a very clear result on the objects that we are presenting in our scenes. And we can even produce different results by changing the color temperature on each and every one of those V-Ray lights.